Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Easy Conversations podcast, a podcast about having easy conversations. I'm your host, Furkan Dandia. In this week's episode, I sit down with Pierre Azzam from the Braver Man Coaching. Pierre shares his experience of transitioning from a psychiatrist to becoming a men's coach. Pierre and I talk about how masculinity in the modern world can prevent vulnerability for men. We also talk about some of the things men can do to be more vulnerable and what others can do to give men the space to ask for help. I really hope you can get a lot out of this episode, and if at the end you can leave a 5-star review, I would truly appreciate it. All right, Pierre, thanks for joining the Easy Conversations podcast today. I'm super grateful for you taking the time and coming on here and giving me the opportunity to have this conversation with you. With everything going on, I appreciate you taking the time. And before we get started and kind of get into the conversation we want to have today, I just want to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself and tell the listeners a little bit of what it is you do and some of the areas you're focused on when it comes to specifically working with men.
Yeah, thanks, Furkan. So my name is Pierre Azzam. I'm a physician by training and practiced as a psychiatrist for the last 15 years before seeking training and certification in professional coaching. And a big chunk of my work now is in helping men at times of pivotal life events. And so I started Braver Man Coaching and have been working with men at times of major career shifts, major life and relationship shifts. Mm-hmm. And a lot of that, I think, is very rooted in a strong interest in men's mental health and normalizing conversations around our own mental wellness.
Mm-hmm. So I guess for listeners, where are you based? I know you're in the US and Florida.
Yeah. So I'm just north of Miami, and my work is virtual. So I work with men all over.
Cool. Yeah. So what was and I mean, some of the work you're doing is very relatable, but what caused that shift from being a psychiatrist to want to be a coach and specifically working with men? Like, what was that kind of point for you where I was like, okay, I want to try something different here?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. I think for me, it was maybe 10 years into practicing that I began to become increasingly interested in helping men, particularly men who are experiencing depression. But a big chunk of that was related to work that I'd been doing. Just a small segment of my work was helping moms, pregnant moms who were hospitalized. And we often set up services for mom post-delivery. And one of the common factors that would come into play was dad's situation, dad's mental health. And there really wasn't very much going on in terms of mental health services for new fathers. And so that led to a little bit of interest in paternal mental health. And there's, as you can probably imagine, there's kind of a growing literature around paternal depression and paternal mental health. But it's still relatively very small, and there are very few sites that provide specific services. But as I started to delve into build this interest around helping men at times of early fatherhood, at times of new fatherhood, a lot of the work that supported services really supported taking a coaching model. Right. And so I became really interested in finding out more about what coaching entailed. And a big part of that initially was just to complement my work as a psychiatrist. Mm-hmm. I thought very much that I would just add to the kind of mix of work that I was doing in psychiatry set of skills in coaching. But I really enjoyed and continue to enjoy working with men to look towards the future, to build a vision for themselves that is very based on their own personal values. And I think just having experienced myself depression, having sought mental health care historically and also provided mental health care, there's value, extreme value, I think, to traditional mental health services. But often I'd find myself wanting more in terms of building the future. So getting past the point of being asymptomatic or having symptoms under control, what would my future actually look like? How do I incorporate some of the work that I was doing in therapy or in more traditional forms of mental health care into the rest of my life? Something that was very future focused. And I think that was relatable to me both as a man and as a mental health professional. And so I found myself increasingly working with men as a coach. And so opted to start Braver Man and really to work specifically with men who were experiencing a major change in life. Now you can imagine over the last year that's meant changes in career, loss of family members and friends, and relationship changes in addition to early fatherhood. But I think I've enjoyed working with men who just are coming in wanting to wanting to revisit their own personal sense of purpose or their values. And so don't always have to have a major life shift, but often that is the sort of catalyst for wanting to seek the work.
No, that's great. And, you've touched on many things here, so we'll try to kind of get into them one at a time. But yeah, the parents' mental health, the paternal side of it is, I've been fortunate enough to have a couple of folks on my podcast talk about it. So both of them from the UK, Scott Mayer and Mark Williams. And it sounds like their work is also like the stuff they're talking about is expanding into the US. Where I am in Canada, it's not, at least based on what I've seen, there's not a lot of talk about it. So I think it's one of those things, like you said, it needs a lot more work and research and more conversation really to kind of normalize it, like you said. I also appreciate how you were able to kind of differentiate between, the work you were doing before and some of the coaching and the differences between the two. I don't think people appreciate it as much. And the reason why I want to explore that a little bit more is I'm also studying psychology and
yeah, I saw that.
Yeah. So I think with that, it's you're really in that field, you're looking at, okay, well, what got me here? What were the things that led to this person? Right. And that's great. I think it's instrumental in understanding your past behaviors and patterns and trauma and all of that. But when the coaching side comes in, is really aligning with your values, like you said, and build planning for the future, setting your goals. Do you incorporate both in your practice when you're working with clients?
Yeah, I think it's impossible not to incorporate a little bit of the kind of work that I'd been doing as a psychiatrist in terms of therapy. And certainly the work itself is pretty strictly in the coaching space. And so I work with many men who also see therapists and work with psychiatrists separately. And so I don't necessarily blend the two. And I think that there's value to kind of keeping the two a bit, or keeping the coaching work at least very focused on particular gains and kind of in a circumscribed way. And so I often work with men over the course of anywhere from 3 to 18 months. And whereas they may be working with a therapist for the sort of foreseeable future. And so I don't mix the two, but I very much support seeking mental health care simultaneously, either in parallel or serially. and also incorporate uh, very mental health informed practices within coaching. Certainly, I think in terms of the psychotherapies that feel like they're really highly represented in coaching work, I'd
Mhm.
say cognitive behavioral therapy and Gestalt therapy are probably the two, and motivational interviewing
Yeah.
would likely be the third, but very rooted in appreciating our thoughts, the sensations that come up often reflexively when we're experiencing challenges,
Mhm.
and also joy, and also looking at major ways in which we want to make change in our life and how to do that in a way that doesn't feel so judgmental. I think
Mhm.
often when we want to make a change, like change to nutrition or change to our physical activity or change to how we use substances or spend our money, there's a lot of self judgment that comes into play. And oftentimes that ends up holding us back.
Mhm.
And so being able to bring in facets of mental health awareness and practice into the coaching space has been really like it's been really fun.
Mhm.
It's also been challenging in some ways, but it's allowed for a little bit of creativity.
Mhm. Yeah,
Yeah.
no, for sure. And that's great that you mentioned that. I guess for listeners that don't know what Gestalt therapy is, it's really empowering the client to kind of come up with the answers or the solutions, and you're kind of just guiding them. So I find that very powerful because for people that are really looking for coaching, that is, like you said, it's a great way to embed that as a psychotherapy into your practice.
Yeah, agreed.
Um, and one of the things you mentioned was the loss we've all experienced over the past, feels like a really
Yeah,
long
feels
time,
familiar.
but yeah,
Yeah, it
we're
does.
over a year now. And I guess, and I talked about it recently with people as well, but like, loss and the grief is really experienced in the way we also live our lives, right? And we've all kind of lost our freedom. We lost our ability to travel or go see family and friends,
Yeah.
our and even the way we live our lives. So, I think for people that are kind of experiencing, um, and I don't want to say mental health, but any form of anxiety or even parts of depression, just be kind to yourself and be mindful that um, this is a form of grief and loss. So that's one of the things I wanted to highlight in terms of what you've talked about it, and in terms of the clients you're working with as well.
I think that's beautiful. I think seeing our experiences through a lens of grief is pretty powerful because it speaks to the range of the experiences and sometimes the quickness with which we might go from one experience to another.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe experiences of anger or sadness, um, all in one stretch, and so it becomes a little bit. I think, at least for my own experience, there's a little bit of giving ourselves grace when we realize that uh, there has been that we've grieved the
Mm-hmm.
loss of, in many cases, the loss of loved ones. But for those of us who may have had COVID and recovered, that can be loss of function. For many, it's been loss of job or loss of income. But I think for all of us, it's been loss of a normalized way of life, and,
Yeah.
and that certainly it takes time to grieve. And I think the more we allow ourselves the freedom and grace to and compassion to do that,
Mm-hmm.
the more capable we are of doing it without self judgment.
For sure, for sure.
Yeah.
And then I just wanted to get into kind of the stuff you talked about in terms of working with men. And what I appreciated, and I think what kind of started our conversation over Instagram, was your call to action. You really want to step into the space and explore all the topics that are relevant in when it comes to men's mental health.
Do.
I guess you shared the motivation behind it in terms of, your own experiences and some of the things you were seeing in your profession. But what are some of the things you're seeing in terms of the challenges around men's mental health, whether it is the lack of focus? Obviously it's becoming more talked about, but what are some of the challenges you're seeing in this space?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of them, but one of the big ones that we touched upon in our conversations has been around how mental health even fits into the idea of being a man. And so, how do masculinity and mental health fit in together?
Mhm.
And I think that relationship has been pretty contentious. And I would say perhaps a big part of what has supported models of coaching in men's health has to do with approachability and the way in which we might see action oriented, future focused, strengths based practices as opposed to traditional forms of mental health care. And so part of the conversation is really a knowledge, filling in knowledge gaps. There are, as you are likely aware and know of, just based on your own professional experience, some substantial knowledge gaps when it comes to appreciating mental health. And I'd say part of that is, part of it is just that the brain as an organ is pretty complicated. And I'd say even, my career has been a modest one, but I'd say that even someone who's practiced their whole lives wouldn't be able to claim a full awareness of how the brain does what it does and how it malfunctions in mental health, in mental illness.
Yeah.
There's really a limited appreciation for how we go from an awareness of what happens within the neurons and within the circuits of the brain to how it shows up behaviorally or cognitively or emotionally for us as men, women, children, anybody. And so I would say there's gaps in knowledge that are just between professionals in mental health care and folks who don't practice in mental health care but experience experience mental illness. There are also gaps between appreciating how to live healthily from a mental health standpoint, and also what constitutes illness and what are the underpinnings of illness. So I think a big part of that has to do with, or a big part of my work around mental health advocacy and awareness is really filling in those gaps in as much as they can be filled in, because frankly, there's so much about mental health and about the brain that we don't know and are unlikely to know within our lifetimes.
Right.
But what we do know, I think, making accessible to folks has been a really important part of my mission, and really appreciating where the line is. I mean, sort of how to differentiate what might serve your own wellness or mental health versus what constitutes illness. And even that is kind of its own philosophical discussion that we could have at a different time.
Yeah.
But really appreciating the underpinnings of illness and how to approach conditions like depression and anxiety, which are so filled with judgment and stigma. How to approach them in a way that is informed.
Yeah.
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 That's been a really big push. But yeah, I think understanding ideologies of masculinity is a big part of what led me to want to expand my own offerings into the coaching realm.
Sure.
Really appreciating how most of us in the West anyway see ourselves and see masculinity, and how mental health care and mental health more generally fits into that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think there's, at least from my perspective, there's two separate issues here that you've identified. And one of them is just the lack of knowledge or awareness that people may have when it comes to mental health. But the other issue for men, at least, is the masculinity part. And I find often those two kind of compound each other in terms of the issues that persist, and the stigma, at least around it, because for at least from what I've seen, most of the time, men don't have the knowledge, which is obviously troubling, or a problem. And then it's the masculinity where they don't want to be vulnerable and speak up or even say that they need help.
Yeah,
Is that something you see? And I know you touched on it a little bit, but
yeah.
on the masculinity side, like, what are the things you see, and what are some of the things you try to do to at least mitigate that?
Yeah, no, that's a huge part of it. And I think it's so common that I don't know that I've worked with uh, a single man who's been immune to the sort of like the traditional ideologies of masculinity. I
Mm-hmm.
think it impacts us all, and uh, present company included.
Yeah.
So like there's an element of just getting really authentic and sometimes vulnerable that is important in relating to other men, especially in this space.
Mm-hmm.
But calling out some of the ideas, the values, the expectations that are shared about what makes a man in Western traditional ideology. And that may be seen as sort of as an overvalued set of expectations for what makes an ideal man. And it's the dominant script really for us culturally in the West. I mean, there are aspects that are shared with other cultures, but there are some discrepancies. And I think a lot of the research, at least in the psychology of men and masculinities, is looked at the dominant script for men culturally in the West. And that's been described by many psychologists and sociologists. But there are sort of four big elements that were described that are often cited in data around and research around the psychology of men and masculinities. And they were devised by, I think they were a psychologist and a sociologist pair, David and Brannon, back in the late 70s. But they've persisted as sort of like the like psychological research equivalent of man laws, and they're really sort of distilled down into four components that traditional Western ideologies around masculinity define: that men should never be feminine, should be respected for achievement, should never show weakness, should seek adventure and risk, even to the point of violence.
Yeah.
And they've described it as in ways that could be more memorable: no sissy stuff, no tears, no overt emotionality, no clothing or anything that would be identified as overtly feminine, being the big wheel. So I guess in today's words, sort of being the alpha,
Yes.
to be respected, admired for status, admired for capability, for earnings, for personal records. You see this on Instagram all the time.
Yeah.
To be the big wheel. So we see this obviously, as I mentioned, PRs, right? So we see this a lot in terms of the fitness approach on Instagram. I guess the third one, never show weakness, was described as be the sturdy oak.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was to be silent, strong, self-sufficient. In today's words, that I suppose would be the lone wolf.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
the last was to give them hell. So take risks, be daring, don't shy away from danger. When the choice between violence and shirking away, appearing weak comes up, always pick violence.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're exaggerated. Obviously, these are exaggerated, and they're exaggerated for a reason. It's not that each one in itself, each of these components of traditional idealized masculinity, it's not that each one is negative, or to use a word that gets thrown around a lot now, toxic. Mm-hmm. It's that in their extremes, the expectations can be harmful to other people, but actually research suggests more so to ourselves as men.
Yeah.
Certainly to other people. I mean, we see this a lot in terms of impulsive violence, in terms of sexual violence, in terms of people abusing power in order to appear a certain way. Mm-hmm. So these are described in their extremes.
You're right.
Yeah. And again, for a reason. But
Yeah.
the experience that happens for most of us is that there's a strain. There may be some discord between what happens when we live our lives as men, when we face the sort of deviation from an expectation that society may set for us in its extreme. And so we ask ourselves, am I man enough? I think that question becomes so shame-filled that we either don't talk about the experiences in which we feel diminished, or the fact that, quite frankly, these overvalued ideas, they're extremes for a reason. They mm-hmm. actually don't serve us all that well. And so we see these traditional ideals everywhere.
Yeah.
I alluded to social media and, these very idealized depictions of what we should look like. Certainly mm-hmm. this is huge this is probably even bigger, I think. I know in ideals of women's bodies. Mm-hmm. But we've certainly seen a growth in idealized images of men's bodies. And so, but the traditional masculine ideals get kind of exploited everywhere.
Yeah.
Men wanting to be stronger, faster, better, more virile, having more money, more things, being richer, just effectively more. And we tend to sort of conflate having these things with greater confidence or achievement or virility. But it's been interesting because a lot of the research actually shows that holding on really tightly to these extremes of masculine ideal is associated with some negative outcomes. So fear of intimacy, more negative attitudes towards diversity and tolerance, certainly avoidance of help seeking. Mm-hmm. And so men who adhere very, very strongly to traditional Western norms and might experience this discord when they naturally will fall short of this extreme ideal, mm-hmm. Often experience poorer health, lower sexual function, lower self-esteem, dissatisfaction in relationships, emotional difficulties. So mm-hmm. I would say, though a big part of my work is not necessarily to debunk the traditional Western ideology of masculinity, because there are many elements that feel, for most men, for myself included, like they fit into what our definitions of being a man are all about.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when not taken to extremes, these ideals become being self-sufficient, not falling apart at the risk of danger, being strong, being courageous. It's when they're taken to extremes, and then we judge ourselves for not for the natural falling short of
Right.
those extremes, that it becomes harmful to us, it becomes harmful to other people.
Mm-hmm.
We judge ourselves against an ideal that's long been touted by society, only to have the inflexibility and the rigidity of those ideals kind of shoot us in the face.
Mm-hmm.
So a big
Mm-hmm.
part of this um, is looking at our own strengths, appreciating the elements of masculinity that are positive, that are a big part of who we are, recognizing our own self-image um, and the strengths therein. Sometimes, often, I would say, even when there is a discrepancy with these sort of four idealized visions of masculinity.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, I mean, you mentioned earlier as we were getting into this discussion that we could sit here and debunk it for hours, but part of the problem I think is the way media has glorified these uh, idealistic views of men, right? Like the most successful person is the most famous athlete, the person with all this wealth, and you see it in movies as well, right? So um like everyone wants to be a Tony Stark.
Yeah,
So
yeah, definitely.
it's just the way we grow up as men. That's what we see the superhero being, or the athlete just being successful and getting all the attention, getting all the women, and naturally we're gonna gravitate towards that. And I think it is important to deconstruct that, but it is really hard as well because we've been wired a certain way. So I think having conversations like this, and again, like we said earlier, normalizes this, but it needs to happen more frequently. And the other piece of keeping it together, I think, shows up in relationships too, and that's something I think about, and I can understand both perspectives. But as men, if you tell your friends or your partner that you're struggling, whether you're dealing with minor depression or whatever it may be, now does that become your image? Do they start treating you differently, or do they start wondering, okay, well, is this guy depressed, or it's just something minor or situational based that he's dealing with? But that's the fear, and I think that's the risk you take. And I completely understand that being vulnerable is important, but I can also understand why there's that fear of being vulnerable.
Of course, of course. I think that's a big fear, and add to it that um, a lot of the data suggests that we see depression as a weakness.
Mm-hmm.
Especially men will often see a man who's experiencing depression as somehow more feminine,
Mm-hmm.
and and um, and the two are often cited together in terms of research as conflated with one another, right? And that is to say, not necessarily that the feminine is the weak in this case, but that most men who have grown up in the West want to look as manly, as masculine as possible. And so if we see this very genderless condition, I mean, like there is nothing masculine or feminine about depression
Mm.
as being innately not masculine, it becomes even harder than somehow we've gendered it.
Yeah.
It's really interesting, but um, it leaves us feeling less inclined to be open about it. And perhaps the gendering of depression is quite simply um, the feeling of being um, out of control of our own emotion.
Mm-hmm.
being vulnerable to something that is bigger than we are, feeling smaller or diminished. That's such a part of depression that sort of naturally fits that men might view depression in this sort of gendered way. But I think you're right. I mean, there's a big element of being vulnerable that's necessary to let other people know what you're experiencing. And there's also this shame that you're going to be seen in this judged way. But, we end up judging ourselves, especially those of us who experience depression, as less masculine, and then we isolate ourselves from each other out of fear of appearing needy, only to judge ourselves as insufficient for being isolated. And so it's this sort of naturally, then we're going to wall ourselves off and be less vulnerable.
Right.
And so, to your point, it's been really amazing to see. I think especially pro athletes who are just seen as larger than life, courageous and daring in every way, admit their humanity, admit experiences of struggling in some way.
Yeah.
It sort of debunks this myth of an ideal, but I think more importantly, it shows that person's humanity, that none of us is immune from
Yeah.
struggle.
Yeah, I remember it was when Kevin Love came out, and when he was playing with the LeBron, and he came out and talked about his struggles. And I think that was huge. And other athletes have also come out, but I think to your point, if professional athletes are making it or vocalizing it and normalizing those conditions or conversations, I think it is so important, because it becomes that much more easier for everyone else to kind of accept it and talk about. And I think there's a responsibility for everyone involved, the person who's being vulnerable, but by thanking them and also checking in with them rather than making them feel like they're fragile or whatever. I think there's a responsibility on both ends, where together, if we kind of have that community of people that are supportive as well, then it makes it easier for people to also step up and ask for help or share whatever they may be struggling with.
Yeah, agreed. For Con, that's a really important point. I think and I don't know the percentages, but I would imagine for every few hundred supportive statements, there may be one that that isolates or stigmatizes. And so oftentimes that one can be powerful to people who are seeing comments or hearing commentary. And so, I think there's a lot of work to be done in normalizing the conversation. Really, I think for both men and women, in terms of appreciating mental health, but in many ways the odds are stacked against men when it comes to the kind of attachment to masculinity associated with mental health. I don't know that it's shared in the same way. I think lots of the data suggests women are more likely to experience depression, for example, and men maybe half as likely. But we also know that the strong tie to masculine ideology probably means that men are about half as likely to report depressive symptoms. So we don't actually know. My hunch is that so many men, and more than a hunch, I think it's supported by data here, that so many men are suffering in silence. And so you're absolutely right. The reception of major figures, particularly athletes, I think because they're just part of their work, part of their craft is being strong, or being physically capable, which is so valued by men. That there's a big responsibility on our parts to ensure that they're received well and they also get the care that they need. Because there's a really strong tendency, I'd imagine, certainly I experience it, to see someone who may have lots of resources, lots of esteem or status, and imagine they've got it all figured out, they've got it covered. In many cases, that's not the case.
No.
Yeah.
No, and Pierre, I just want to thank you again for coming on here and
Yeah. Thank
having this
you.
conversation. This has been great. And, I love how you've been able to kind of talk about a lot of the stuff you're seeing and share your own experiences. I really appreciate that. And
Of course. Thank you.
for listeners that want to find you online, social media, what are the best
Yeah.
ways to get a hold of you?
Sure. So my site is bravermancoaching.com and my Instagram handle is at braver.man.
Awesome. And those are the two ways to find you.
Absolutely.
Awesome. No, and again, super grateful for you taking the time and doing this. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Well, that's the end of the episode. Thank you again for tuning in. As always, please leave a 5-star review. And until next week.